How you doing, Paul from Deutsche Auto Parts? Your source for Volkswagen and Audi parts, performance, and accessories. Today we're going to be going over the Magnuson-Moss Act and common misconceptions about it. So Steve, hey, appreciate you coming on. Want to talk a little bit about Magnuson-Moss, what it is, all about it. Give me a little bit of background about yourself, what you do, and what your background is within that space.
I'm an attorney in the state of Michigan, and I've been practicing law now for 24 years. And I've also taught law school. I taught 10 years of consumer protection at the University of Detroit. And the focus of my practice for the last 23, almost 24 years has been nothing but lemon law. So I handle lawsuits involving defective cars and also lawsuits involving defective products. And by lemon law, there is actually a Michigan state lemon law, and all 50 states have got lemon laws. But there's also a law called the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, which is often called the federal lemon law. Every single lemon law case I've ever filed has also had a count in it for the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. So I've studied the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act inside and out. I've read it front to back. I've argued it in front of judges. I've argued it on appeal. I've tried cases involving the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. In fact, I was in court just a couple weeks ago and had a long discussion with the judge on the record over a finer point of the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. This is what I do all day long. So when people ask me questions about the lemon law or the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, this is my livelihood. This is what I do. Okay, well, awesome. I guess we're talking to the right guy then. So to me, what is the intention of the Magnuson-Moss Act? Well, the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act was originally passed by two guys named Magnuson and Moss, who are the two primary sponsors of the bill. And it was an attempt by Congress in Washington, D.C., to put some teeth into warranty laws. And the law is very, very broad. It covers a lot of things. It actually talks about if you're going to call a warranty a full warranty, what that means. And it actually sets a lot of minimum standards and says, if you're going to call it a full warranty, it's got to do this. Otherwise, you've got to call it a limited warranty. And it lays out all kinds of things that warrantors must do if they don't want to run afoul of the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission actually oversees the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. And so one of the things it did, for instance, is it said basically if you're a warrantor and you put a product out there that you have a warranty on, if you force someone to sue you over that and you lose, then the consumer can get their attorney fees and court costs paid by the manufacturer because you just forced the consumer to go through this. And that attorney fee provision was huge because prior to that, a lot of manufacturers would look at somebody and go, screw you, we'll see you in court. And people couldn't afford to go to court. So that's one of the things it did, but it also talks about all the different things that companies can do with respect to their warranties. And where it pops up a lot on the internet and people I talk to is they've heard that the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act talks about whether or not you can penalize somebody or punish somebody who bought a product and then modified that product. And the law can help consumers, but there's just so much confusion in this area that more often than not, people are invoking the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act wrong.
No, I completely agree. I've been being in the dealership world for about 12 years and then leaving that, and now I'm doing my own thing. And we were in the performance space a little bit. We're really heavily in the VW and Audi community. A lot of those guys modify their cars.
Right.
The reason why we wanted to get into this was because we feel like there is a lot of misinformation out there. So give me some. My understanding has always been that the Magnuson-Moss Act was actually intended for essentially when it comes to vehicle application, when people originally were modifying or were getting their cars serviced outside of dealerships, the dealerships were attempting to void the warranty for maintaining a vehicle in an quote-unquote aftermarket place where the vehicle was no longer covered under warranty because you had your oil changed at Jiffy Lube, for example.
Right. Yeah, and that is the big prohibition regarding this in the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, is that a manufacturer cannot make its warranty contingent on you using their parts. So for instance, if you buy a Ford product, I drive Ford Explorers. I got a Ford Explorer right now. I can go get the oil changed any place I want. I don't have to use Motorcraft parts. I don't have to use Motorcraft oil. Okay, if you have a General Motors product and the alternator goes bad and you decide to get it replaced, not under warranty for whatever reason, you don't have to use an AC Delco alternator as long as you use one that's appropriate. So they specifically say that they cannot tie the warranty to your use of a specific brand. It doesn't have to be their brand, but they can say you've got to use an appropriate oil filter, an appropriate air filter, but they can't make you use theirs. Because as you can imagine, if they were allowed to do that, they would say you got to use our stuff and they'd jack the prices up on it. So they can't make you use their stuff. But that doesn't mean that you can just go and modify anything you want. So the best example I can give you is I had a client once came to me and said, Steve, I've got a vehicle. It runs rough and they can't fix it. And I'm going through the repair orders and I noticed a couple notations that the mechanics made, and one of them pointed out that my client had installed an aftermarket chip into something underneath the hood, okay? And the aftermarket chip, of course, is something that goes to a control module or an under hood computer that messes with the engine's performance. Now, I think the car came with some kind of chip from the factory, but this hopped up chip, it was a different brand, so they couldn't get him in trouble by saying, hey, look, you used the wrong brand of chip. But the problem was that this chip was not the same as the chip that came from the factory. This chip did something different. I don't know if it affected the timing or it affected the fuel mix. I don't know, but it did something that affected the performance of the car. So they said to him, if you remove the chip and bring it back to us and let us work on the car in its unmodified state, we'll honor that warranty all day long. That's one of the misconceptions people have. People think, oh, if I've modified my car, they're going to void my warranty. I've never heard of anybody who actually had their warranty voided. And trust me, in 24 years of practice, thousands of clients and tens of thousands of phone calls with consumers, I've never heard of this. It doesn't happen. They don't void your warranty. They would simply deny that warranty claim. And if they're denying the warranty claim because you modified the vehicle and that modification is causing the defect or causing the malfunction that you're describing, obviously they can deny that claim because it's not their fault, it's your fault for the modification.
Right, and I think that's the biggest misconception, and the other component that I feel like is always talked about when it comes to Magnuson-Moss is proof of burden being on the warrantor, but if I'm correct, in the case of modification, that does not apply. Is that correct?
Well, it's tricky, and there's a lot of case law on this, and I've actually taught this class. This is actually one day we spend in class talking about consumer protection. If you've got a warranty on a vehicle and your vehicle malfunctions, you have the right to bring it in and demand that they fix it. And if they can't fix it and you're forced to sue them, the burden is on you to prove that there's a warranty and the warranty's been breached. Now, the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act and most other laws that involve this actually say that the warrantor can raise as a defense abuse, misuse, or modification or alteration of the consumer goods that caused the problem. The manufacturer will have to prove that also, but they only have to prove it by preponderance, which means more likely than not. So imagine it's like a game of ping pong, okay? Mm-hmm. You get to serve it over the net when you prove that there was a warranty that they breached, but they can hit it back by saying, yeah, but you caused it. And a jury would get asked to decide that. And I like to point out to people, and I've had people call me and they say, Steve, but I'm right, I know I'm right. And I always tell them, you can be right all day long. The only way you can prove this or win this is to get in front of a jury. And getting there is expensive, time-consuming, and might not be worth the argument. So my best example I can give you is I've had clients before call me up and they say, Steve, they're refusing to do warranty work on my vehicle because it's been modified. I tell my clients, if you can undo the modifications, undo them, and then bring the vehicle in and see if it still does that. Because number one, if it doesn't do that, then it's not defective. And if it still does that, it eliminates that one defense that they have. Now, I understand not all modifications can be undone. So you might wind up in a gray area where you've done some modification to your vehicle that cannot be undone. And if they can say, hey, this modification is tied to this defect, then you're going to be in that argument. And again, the only way to resolve that argument in your favor is to go in front of a jury, and that's a trial after a lot of litigation, and convince a jury and win that. You might win, but you're talking about a year down the road and thousands of dollars of legal fees.
Yeah, and that to me, I think that's the biggest component that most people miss is that even if you're right, and I think that I want to touch on one point you talked about right there because I want to make sure it's ultra clear to people because I feel like this is where people get often confused is even if you take that off and you go back and the problem is still there, there's still a possibility they're going to discuss and say, okay, well, yes, the problem is still there even though you took off the part that we say caused it, but the reality is that the part you took off caused the problem.
that's a possibility, okay? And here's my thing. The best example I can give you on this, I had a client who actually had a dealership try to void a warranty repair or a warranty claim because he had a K&N air filter on his truck, okay? And millions of those are sold. Everybody, I have had one on my truck. The K&N air filter didn't cause anything. I told my client, I said, dude, take that off, put the old one back on, and take it back in. Why not? It's so simple to do that. If they don't know, they can't make that claim. And I've had clients say, well, because I'm right. And I said, you know something? No one wants to be right and go through this kind of hassle. Just take it off and just play along a little bit. But you're right. So my client, for instance, who had the chipped, performance Volkswagen, it was actually a Volkswagen, speak of the devil, he actually brought it in for repairs with that chip in place, and somebody drove it and they said, this thing's acting wacky because of that chip. You're right, because if they now remove the chip, put the old one back in, or whatever they do to return it to stock, if that engine now behaves badly, they are going to say, well, something you did to it back then damaged something internally or caused something bad to happen. This vehicle can no longer be returned to its stock state. And again, that might not be the case, but the only way to win that argument is to litigate it and win in court.
Right. And I mean, what's a realistic time frame for resolving an issue like that? Are we talking about normal time? 6 months, 8 months, 2 years?
You're literally talking towards a year or longer, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. And I've had cases before. The one I was just in court on, I think it was about 8 months from filing of the lawsuit to where we were actually in court for trial. I mean, 8 months, and that was a fast court. I've had other courts where it takes a year and a half, 2 years to get to court. And meanwhile, you have to deal with the problem. So, like, let's suppose they void your warranty of repair. They refuse to do the repair. You think you're right. You file the lawsuit. They still haven't fixed your vehicle. So if you need that vehicle to get around, you've got problems, or you got to pay to fix it yourself. Something, So you're gonna have this problem, this practical problem, and rather than riding out the length of the lawsuit trying to prove your point, you can avoid the problem in the first place by removing the modification originally, or going that route.
Right. But the reality is that even if there is information, and I'm sure you're not intimately familiar with the systems with VW, they have basically a system that automatically flags modified ECMs in the vehicle. Basically, once the VW scan tools hook up to them, they look at the information and they'll flag them if they're modified. Once you get to that point, and this is an automatic procedure for which anytime you're getting a vehicle diagnosed, you're going to have that happen and potentially get flagged. If that happens, you have no recourse because, again, like we mentioned before, there is potential always fault of blaming something with the modification. Even all they have to do is know that it's there, and then it can become a problem, right?
Well, yeah. Let me ask you a question though. When they flag the ECM, can the consumer return the ECM to stock if they wanted to?
They could by flashing it back to stock. I'm just not sure what the implications are.
Because what I would advise my client to try to get it back to stock and then bring it back and go, guys, it's back to stock now. Does that solve the problem?
Let me ask you this.
But you're right, because they're going to say no, that doesn't solve the problem.
Right. If you blow up an engine, let's say you have performance software on the newer cars, new Mark 7 GTIs, pretty popular. 100 horsepower for a chip immediately right off the bat. What you blow up your engine, what recourse do you have?
Well, in that case, you're going to have very little recourse because you're going to go into the dealership and say, guys, the engine blew. They're going to say, yeah, it blew because you're putting too much horsepower through it, and that caused it to throw a rod or something, okay? And you're going to say, well, and one of the things that I often hear people say, and it drives me crazy, they go, but the chip manufacturer said that that's not the case. And I say, yeah, the chip manufacturer's not the one on the hook for the repair either, are they? Why do you believe the word of somebody who's trying to sell you something? I mean, it's counterintuitive. So if your engine blows and they deny your claim, the next step is litigation. And the only way you can win that lawsuit is if you can bring in an expert who examines the vehicle, examines the chip, and can convince a court he's an expert on this topic, and he says, in my expert opinion, upon inspection of all these things, the chip modification didn't cause the engine to explode. Now, you and I both know Volkswagen's going to bring in a team of guys who are going to inspect the vehicle, inspect the chip, and go, yes, this chip equals this engine explosion. And you're going to get to put your expert on in front of a jury. They're going to get to put their expert on in front of a jury. The jury's going to pick a winner. You could win that. But I got news for you. The cost of your expert, who's that qualified to look at that, is going to cost you more than the engine replacement.
Right.
And if you want to win that on principle and you want to prove a point, knock yourself out. Many attorneys would look at you and say, I'm not even going to touch this case unless you actually give me $5,000 or $10,000 up front so I can hire the experts and talk to them before we even file suit. Because there's a chance if you filed that suit without that expert opinion in hand, it might be frivolous.
Right. Okay, so let's say, hypothetically, somebody has an engine on an Audi that's really expensive. It's a $20,000 engine. They blow it up because it has software, engine blows up. They want to decide that they want to go after Audi of America for the replacement of the engine and hire an expert. What's the likelihood that when you pump out, let's say, 50% more horsepower out of an engine, that there's any reasonable jury that's going to rule in your favor?
That's the biggest problem we have when we go to court in a jury trial is a jury. I had a law professor jokingly say a jury is 12 people off the street too stupid to get out of jury duty. And it's actually not that bad, but if you've ever served jury duty, you know that most people don't like serving jury duty.
Right.
So I tell my clients, I say, look, we're going to have a jury of 6 or 8 with alternates in a civil case who may not be happy they're missing work, and they might not care about your case. And I've gone in and watched other trials. I've conducted trials of my own. I've had juries that were fascinated about what was happening, and I've seen jurors sleeping through stuff. And think about walking down the street in your jurisdiction there and just picking 6 people at random and then sit them down and start talking to them about cars. How many of them are going to have their eyes glaze over because they really don't care and they don't understand?
Right.
So it's always a crapshoot when you get in front of a jury, so you don't know, and it might cost a lot of money just to get there. So, one of the problems that we have with juries is I'm going to bring in my expert, and my expert's going to be really, really good and cost a lot of money and be really, really good and friendly and intelligent and authoritative. Volkswagen's going to bring in an expert who's going to be likewise authoritative, German accent, engineering degrees from Berlin, and who knows who a jury's going to believe. It's going to be literally my expert going yes, their expert going no. Pick a winner. May as well flip a coin.
Right. And I definitely always stress to people, Magnuson-Moss, I've never personally seen in my 13 years in this business, I've never seen somebody execute it in this particular fashion that everybody discusses it as far as modified cars and this and that and all that other stuff. So, which is why I want to discuss to you is because I always felt like this was true, but I have no authority in that space to say that my opinion actually means anything other than my opinion.
Right. I have filed several thousand lawsuits involving the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act. Not a single one ever said, and we're in front of this court because someone denied a warranty claim wrongfully because of a changed part. Now, I've had a few people call my office and say, yeah, I've had a warranty claim denied because I have an altered or modified part of my car. But again, to get from that point into a lawsuit situation literally means they've denied your claim, the value of your claim is enough to make it worth litigating, and your claim is so good and obvious on its face that an attorney is going to say, yeah, I'll happily take that claim and file it for you. In the state of Michigan, there's probably a dozen attorneys who do Mag-Moss and lemon law cases frequently. I'm one of them. And I can tell you right now that none of us would take the case where you call up and go, I chipped my engine and the engine blew up and they denied my claim. Will you file that lawsuit for me? I wouldn't take that because it's just common sense seems to dictate that chip probably had something to do. And even if it didn't have anything to do with the explosion, it certainly would seem like it would. And I have to think, what's a jury going to do? What's a judge going to do? And they're going to look at that and go, what did you expect? You bought this car and you modified it. The engine blew up. That's kind of what you're asking for, isn't it? And that common sense approach is what's going to really doom you here.
Awesome. I definitely think that obviously the theme of all this is when you modify your car, you got to pay to play. and you have to understand the implications of this, which is part of the reason why I want to do this, is to educate anybody who's on the fence of, okay, do I want to modify my car? Okay, here's all the information that's out there. We sell software at our location, but I would never want to give somebody the impression that everything's fine and dandy, warranty's great, head on down the road, you got no problems, just because, no. In our market, it's actually really uncommon. All the dealers offer performance software here, so they don't give people a hard time. Now, the other variable is, some places and some dealers are horrible and give people a hard time over everything. And obviously, that's a big variable in this conversation is a dealer unnecessarily going to blame things that they don't need to just because they either have a misconception about modifications or not enough experience to really understand it, or a whole list of things that could be associated with the reasons why they do that.
One of the things I often talk about is, when you bring your vehicle in for warranty repairs, most dealerships want that business. They want you to bring it in for work. They can do the work and they can submit the bill to General Motors, VW, Chrysler, whoever, and get paid. So it's free money for them. It's money on the table. They're not going to leave it there because they want to mess with you. So many of them will err in favor of you because if it's a paid warranty claim, they get paid. So they're not trying to get your claim denied. But really what I think you need to watch out for is you're flipping through the back of some tuner magazine and you see a little ad in the back and it says, buy this little thing, stick it in your engine, you'll get like 9,000 more horsepower, and we guarantee it'll work. Okay, the second you start modifying your car with that thing, you got to remember, what are they guaranteeing versus what am I doing to my warranty on my car? And the little ad in the back of the magazine that guarantees that this thing's going to work, I don't know if they're going to be standing ready, and able to take care of you when that engine explodes. And that is what's going to happen. Is there's going to be an argument between you and the service writer at the dealership. They're going to say, this ain't our fault. You go talk to them. So now you're calling an 800 number trying to get a hold of somebody who's 9 states away, and they're saying, well, maybe you installed it wrong, maybe they won't even take your phone call. Who knows? So you got to remember, K&N, for instance, the air filters I mentioned earlier. That's a big company, and that's a pretty harmless thing, an air filter. But when you start talking about computer components and electronic control modules and stuff on today's cars, you got to be really careful with that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree, and I think hopefully this educated people to give people an opportunity to understand all the implications of modifying their cars, get an idea of Magnuson-Moss, what it really does, and if it really has a real-world application. In the modified vehicle space, I think we can agree it has very little real-world application, and most people, it's just a word that people throw around hoping that they're going to get something accomplished.
That is correct.
Okay. Well, tell people, Steve, where they can find you.
You can find my website at lehtoslaw.com, LEHTOSLAW.com. And I write frequently for Jalopnik's subblog, The Garage. So if you go on there and you see somebody babbling on about the law and cars, it's almost always me.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, and hopefully this can help some people out.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.